What's new in the world of education? How's the global innovation? Let us do the calculations, use all our imagination. We'll subscribe, no hesitation, with my corroboration. And that's a bet I will not hedge. Listen up, cause it's Ed on the Edge.
Ben Wallerstein is the CEO and co-founder of Whiteboard Advisors, a communications, research, and strategic consulting firm that helps change-making organizations and entrepreneurs make an impact, focusing on education and workforce development. Over the past 20 years, Ben has earned a reputation as the go-to advisor for education's most impactful investors, nonprofit, and corporate leaders. Whiteboard Advisors' research and commentary has appeared in the Washington Post, USA Today, TechCrunch, EdSurge, VentureBeat, and the Huffington Post, among others. In 2022, Ben was named to Washingtonian magazine's annual list of the nation's most influential leaders in education.
Hey, Ben, welcome to Ed on the Edge.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Well, you and I have been friends for decades, and it's fun to see all the stuff that you've done in your career. But before we talk about some of that, give a little bit of your backstory, your background. I know you grew up in Connecticut. I think your parents were teachers, weren't they?
They were. My parents were school teachers. They taught in a really affluent place. My mother was eventually the assistant school superintendent in Greenwich, Connecticut. My dad was a really beloved middle school teacher. He taught art for 36 years in Greenwich. And we lived in Norwalk, Connecticut. And there's a rule in Connecticut that says if two teachers teach in the same place or something to that effect, that they can send their kids to school in the district. And my parents thought that was a very bad idea. I think they viewed it sort of like foundationally as inequitable, and they thought that if either pay teachers enough that they can afford to live in more affluent places, or teachers should send their kids to school in the communities where they could afford to live. And that's sort of controversial, even to a certain extent in the community where I live today. But gave me a front row seat on issues of racial and economic disparity in education, and really informed my perspectives in a big way to this day.
And we'll talk about more of that. But from there, you went to Richmond, which is a beautiful school. I don't know if I've seen a more beautiful school. And then to Georgetown Law School, where you were on Law Review.
Correct. Yes, I was on Law Review, and I started Whiteboard, really, or what became Whiteboard, as a first semester law school student. Yeah.
Well, tell that story, because I didn't even know that.
So I worked right out of college, and I think the first time I met you, and certainly the first time I saw you and knew about you and Deborah, I think was probably like an event in 1999-ish at the Pierre Hotel. I think it was around the time maybe of the Book of Knowledge. But I was headed down a path. I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer since I was 8, and I applied for a Fulbright scholarship. I wanted to do a comparative study of post-apartheid school integration in South Africa, post-Brown v. Board school integration in the Deep South. And I was rejected, which is not entirely surprising. I was a late bloomer academically, but sort of through a twist of fate, ended up hooking up with David Kerns, who was the former chairman and CEO of Xerox.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. I'm going to pause just there, because for younger people, Xerox in those days was basically what a Google or a Facebook would be today. I mean, it was the hottest. It was a hot technology business. It was an important business. David Kerns was, a big name, big deal. And so you got this opportunity to work with him.
I did, and in part because his assistant at the time told me that she would give me 15 minutes on the phone with him if I stopped calling his office. But the original ask of Mr. Kerns was that he serve as an advisor to this Fulbright proposal that I was working on. I figured I'd do that for a year, and then I'd go to law school. And again, I got rejected, and Mr. Kerns hired me. He was blind, so he after Xerox, he went into the George H.W. Bush administration. He took on the job of Deputy Secretary of Education, which to your point was really crazy at the time. Could you imagine the CEO of Google taking a number 2 job at an agency, which wasn't a big deal agency, right? And I think President Bush, as the story goes, wanted him to maybe be White House Chief of Staff or Secretary of the Treasury or Secretary of Commerce. And Mr. Kerns had decided he was going to dedicate the third of his life to transforming American public education. And so as the story goes, he said, like, Mr. President, I don't give a darn about being in your cabinet. I want to work on education, and I'm either going to do that, as a part of your administration. And so Lamar Alexander was going to be the Secretary of Ed. David went in as Secretary Alexander's number 2. And and so at the time I worked for him, he had cancer. He was working on the LA riot recovery efforts, nearly died, had really radical brain surgery, again, lost his vision, but he was on the board of Time Warner, Chase Manhattan Bank, Ford Foundation, Ryder Trucks, and he needed a bodyguard. So I was his seeing eye guy, and had the opportunity to travel with him and sit in on the board meetings of public companies. And that's where I was first exposed to the education industry and to the work that you were doing at the time. And
so what made Mr. Kerns so special? Why did he influence you so much?
I get like a little emotional, even thinking about it, but he was so different than anyone I had ever met. I went in 1999. I was in a bathroom at Xerox headquarters in Rochester, and I ran into this guy who was like he was a janitor or like a utility staffer, and he said, I mentioned, he's like, what are you doing here, young man? And I had like a bad suit. It was probably from like Structure, like a ridiculous tie or something. So I probably stood out like a sore thumb. And he said, he's like, David Kerns was a no bullshit leader that we could all get behind, and he just like up and down the chain. I mean, I just don't think they just don't make people like that anymore. He's just like high integrity. Came at issues. He was a white Republican guy who was chairman of the National Urban League. Vernon Jordan gave his eulogy. So he's just a really remarkable guy in an era where the issues that he was focused on, gender equity, racial equity, and coming at those, not necessarily from a moralistic or a political or even an ideological standpoint, but from the standpoint of an economic imperative, and just from and that's what really drew him into education initially. So he was just a remarkably thoughtful human being who I learned just a tremendous amount from in a very compressed period of time.
So now you're first year law school at Georgetown. So you must have somewhere along the line you got the academic thing going, and then you started Whiteboard there. I imagine.
Yeah, like what became Whiteboard? I was going to say
though, was the Tombs your office? I mean, is that what?
No, it was. So I was unbelievably lucky. So there's a guy named Craig Patty who's still like a very, very dear friend. He's turning 60 this year. He was a groomsman in my wedding. He had been Mr. Kerns' chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Ed, and still kind of helped with the family office. So he was the one that actually interviewed me, and he interviewed all the seeing eye guys over the years who ended up going to work for Mr. Kerns. And so my parents at the time very graciously said, like, hey, we're so proud of you getting into Georgetown. We're gonna help pay for your your rent and stuff while you're in law school. And they very quickly realized, and I realized like that wasn't really an option. I mean, they probably could have like figured out how to do it, and they were extraordinarily generous with both my sister and me, but I needed a job. And you could make that work. Georgetown has something called Section 7. So you can take your law school classes mostly at night, and you could work during the day. So our current Pennsylvania governor was a law school classmate of mine at the time. So it was a really neat group of people who were working on the Hill. The editor at McKinsey Quarterly was a law school classmate of mine. So it was a really unique program. And I took a job as a receptionist at a lobbying firm that gave me free parking. So it was like $16,000 a year. Craig Patty hired me to be the receptionist over there. And I would walk, and like Bush v. Gore was going on really at that point in time, but I would like walk past the Supreme Court every day to law school. And the founder of that firm, including Craig, really had this idea. This was sort of in the era of like the devolution of influence, or like the decentralization of government. So you had like successive governors in the White House who were pushing more and more decision making down to the state and local level. The No Child Left Behind Act hadn't really happened yet. I was like totally smitten from my time with Mr. Kerns. Like I literally had your research, right? Like dog-eared, like would read it all the time. And, John Doerr was really engaged and interested in education at that point in time. So I thought I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, and I became completely smitten with this idea that like emerging tech bubble hadn't burst yet. Like just that emerging technology was going to have a transformative impact on the issues that I cared very, very deeply about in and around education. And then I found myself like going to law school at night, sitting as the receptionist in this little lobbying firm, and like, Terry Branstad would walk in, who had been governor of Iowa, who's kind of an education governor. Jeb Bush was sort of in and out of those circles. So it was just, it was like a really Tommy Thompson, to name a few, but there was just a tremendous amount of like enthusiasm. And of course, these were the days of, George Miller in the House and Ted Kennedy in the Senate. And it was really stars were starting to align around this thing that could be and would be NCLB. And I learned, kind of like apprenticed through that job, learned about like the intersection of federal government and state and local government, the fact that, education is sort of like the paradigmatic example of like a hyper fragmented market where federal funding and federal regulation is braided with state and local funding and state and local regulation in order to affect like a national public interest. Maybe public safety sort of functions in the same way. The Department of Homeland Security was created a little bit later. But it was just like really unique and complex world of public policy where technology was emerging to play a role in helping to effectuate some of those public priorities. And to be honest, like I just wanted to be a part of it. Like I wanted to find some way to be useful and involved in what I saw as this really exciting burgeoning sector.
Well, I can kind of fast forward and look what you've done over the last 20 years plus. Whiteboard has played an enormous role in the positive changes that have taken place in education, and it's really quite impressive. But so now you start Whiteboard kind of as a law student. Tell her a bit, what does Whiteboard Advisors do, and give it a little bit of the history there. Besides the beginning.
Sure. So it wasn't originally called Whiteboard. So like you can picture me, like I'm a receptionist, like I'm reading these like dog-eared versions of your reports, just like tracking, like some people are into, college sports or fly fishing. Like I was interested in the education industry. And because of the work with Mr. Kerns, I got to meet so many interesting people, right? Like Edison Schools was going public the year that I was working for Mr. Kerns. So I got to know Chris Whittle a little bit. And he was extraordinarily gracious, right? Like, I was just so unbelievably fortunate to meet people, including you, including Deborah, who just like were willing to take an interest in a young person who had an aspiration to work in the sector in some form or fashion. The late Mike Sandler, who was creating EduVentures, was a really wonderful mentor. Tom Dretler, people like Chris Hunserick, Bill Hansen. I mean, so I got to meet people who were working in the field. Mike Sandler was creating the Education Industry Association, which people like, John Katzman was sort of involved in and a part of. And it was really unbelievable, to think about like how silly I must have seemed at that point in time and just how kind and open people were. I was kind of looking at what this firm was doing with companies like Motorola, Johnson Controls, Lockheed Martin, helping businesses in the era of eGov. Remember that? Like, oh my gosh, like there's myflorida.com and you can go and like, renew your driver's license on the internet. Like it was, I didn't have email, up until later in college. Right. And so, it was kind of like heady times for the intersection of government and technology. And I just kind of looked at that and said, oh my gosh, like, education is, second or third largest segment of the U.S. economy. It's a field that is on the verge of being transformed by technology. It's happened maybe a little bit slower than I thought. And so in the businesses that were being created, like you had kind of like maybe a rent-seeking mentality on the part of traditional higher ed, on the part of the big and incumbent publishers right, who had really created a regulatory and legislative mechanism that favored their business model. And then you had upstarts, right? Like George Segal at tutor.com was one of my first clients. And I now advise Varsity Tutors, which is an incredible business. It's sort of like taking that whole business model to the next level. I got to know Gaston Caperton, who had just become the head of the College Board as advanced placement was expanding around the country.
Former governor of West Virginia.
Yep.
Right?
Former governor of West Virginia, Larry Berger and Josh Reibel and Greg Gunn, who were creating Wireless Generation, which was in this like terrible office space, like before they moved out to Brooklyn. And they were, they had just secured a license to put observational assessments on Palm Pilots to transform the practice of early literacy. So whether it was George Segal or whether it was the Wireless Generation crew, like people were developing technology that was out of step with the policy and regulatory environment. And they were so brilliant, but not focused on the policy side of it. And of course, like none of those products could go to market unless they either went like through or shaped in some form or fashion the world of public policy. So here's me, like, again, working as a receptionist in a law firm where you get to see, or a lobbying firm where you get to see everything that's happening, right? Like you learn so much as a receptionist or a personal aide. And then I'm going to law school at night. So I'm getting this like sort of more rigorous kind of like substantive underpinning and have this desire to be useful to this field. And so I just got really, really lucky. Like George Segal hired me to help him figure out and understand how federal funding could be applied to support libraries in delivering online tutoring. Wireless Generation hired us in the wake of the passage of the No Child Left Behind Act, really to help understand and think through and to affect their ability to go to market with new forms of observational assessment.
Well, I'll just interrupt you. I think of you and Wireless Generation. I mean, I think you were back to like how you played a role in all this. I mean, your kind of advising and partnership, I think, made a huge difference for them taking this idea and creating the success they did. And I remember those terrible offices. I think they were 14th Street between 5th and 6th, if I have my memory right. But
and the thing was, I mean, like, it was astonishing that anyone hired me because I didn't really know anything. Like I had these incredible colleagues. Like I was working for a former White House political director, and Craig Patty had worked at the Department of Ed, and we had former governors who were colleagues of ours at that point in time. Ben Nelson, Democrat from Nebraska, who got elected to the U.S. Senate around the time that I went to work with them. And so maybe I had like this veneer of credibility because of who I was working with at the time. But ultimately it was really about like specialization, right? Like, Larry and Greg were thinking about like the psychometrics of early assessment, doing licensing deals with Palm and, the University of Oregon. And, they had like really smart people that were building the technology. And then like, I was kind of paid, and eventually Anna, my co-founder, we were kind of, not as probably as smart as any of them, but we had the opportunity on their behalf to just like subspecialize in thinking about like the policy and market side of things. And so we just had to stay like a little bit ahead of them, and we could, we were able to create value.
So as you think about your original, dream of being a civil rights lawyer and what you've done as the CEO of Whiteboard, I mean, where do you see that intersection in the past, but more importantly today and going forward? I mean, increasingly, like I think, we've had conversations for a long time about how education really is the civil rights issue of our day. Well, we've been saying that for 20 years. Now it's going to be a bit of a chorus, which I think is good.
Yeah.
But where do you think things are at, and what are some of the key things that you think can happen to make that more of a reality?
Addressing like the foundational issues, economic, racial, political, if you look at like Michael Collins' work at JFF, and he writes a lot about like occupational segregation, things like that. I mean, and I think he's one of the smartest people on that topic. All of these issues require sort of a multifaceted approach. I think technology is a big piece of that. I think that the private sector writ large, including not just private commercial businesses and investors, but also nonprofit organizations, are a key part of the equation. We've done a lot of work going way back with code.org, for example, really like introducing and incorporating computer science education into K-12 schools. Like as a result of their work and Hadi's leadership, far more students in the United States of America from a wide range of backgrounds are exposed to computer science and computational thinking as a discipline. And I think that like the long-term implications of that, not the short-term labor market implications, but the long-term implications of that are really, really, really profound. The work that I think a lot of people don't even fully appreciate it or give it that much credit, but like the work of that Wireless Generation did very early on to transform and evolve the field of observational assessment has had a profound impact, not just on literacy rates, but on the reduction of inappropriate referrals into special education. And students don't get referred out of special education, and it has a profound disparate impact on students that are historically underrepresented in the labor market and in college and other things. So I think, sometimes I'm probably Pollyannish to a certain extent, and like our work is just like this little teeny piece of the puzzle. But I look at the work we do with Byron Agist at Opportunity at Work and the Tear the Paper Ceiling campaign, which is sort of I think exposing some of the distortions in the labor market that manifest from longstanding college degree requirements. Ryan Craig has done a bunch of writing in that area as well. And that's a really important thread to pull. We're doing a lot of work with both technology companies and in the public policy space, focused on hiring of formerly incarcerated individuals. What our friend Ken Oliver calls talent with records. Johnny Taylor at SHRM is doing a lot of work on that. He and I just wrote an op-ed on this topic for the Birmingham Business Journal the other day. But the unemployment rate for formerly incarcerated people in my new home state of Alabama is like 27%. Like the Gen Pop unemployment rate's like 3 or 4%. So back to David Kerns, that has big economic and competitiveness implications, for the state. So, I'm not doing civil rights law. There are certainly folks who have a mission orientation. I think that's much stronger than mine and have a lot more, effectiveness and credibility on any number of issues. But, our work is hopefully a little piece of the puzzle.
So you moved from Washington, D.C. to Alabama, as you just referenced.
Yeah.
How's that been?
Awesome.
What's better and what's been more challenged than you expected?
Well, we had a stopover in Florida. So we moved to Florida for a month, and we stayed for 3 years in the Florida Panhandle. So 3 hours south of Montgomery, Alabama. My wife is from Birmingham, as you know. And that kind of got us out of DC. And if, as you also know, when we were in DC, we would spend, maybe a quarter of the year in the Bay Area, which we
Right.
love. But Birmingham is a really remarkable place. And I could not be happier to be here. In some ways, it feels, like 10, 15 years ago, being in the Bay Area was to me, extraordinarily exciting. I remember you picking me up at the airport and just go to dinners at Joe Lonsdale's house, or it's just wow, just my head was exploding, I just was learning so much all the time, and so many people doing interesting things. And of course, that's still happening, and not just there, but in other parts of the country. But I feel the same level of excitement and enthusiasm being here now in Birmingham. The leadership at the state level is notwithstanding challenges, and I think the challenges are often more heavily publicized than the wins. There are just some really remarkable things going on in public sector financing and education reform.
We got the Birmingham Stallions, 3 times winner of the USFL.
We got the Stallions. We got the Stallions. We got a new head coach, which I'm really excited about here. Roll Tide, and we've got this incredible mayor. Randall Woodfin is, and Randall Woodfin, the mayor of Birmingham, and our governor Kay Ivey, in some ways probably could not be, in the context of the broader national discourse, more at odds. But what's interesting here is that maybe it has to do with the size. Maybe it has to do with Southern hospitality. Again, I'm from Connecticut, but there's a collegiality and a collaborative spirit here, which is just so exciting. And big businesses have been built here, companies Shipt was founded here in Birmingham. There's a tremendous amount of private capital that people are putting to work. So it's a really exciting place to be.
So as you look on the national stage, as it relates to education innovation, what states or governors in particular are you impressed by?
I think we're in the doldrums in some ways when it comes to innovation and reform. We're still having, particularly at the state level, yesterday's arguments, I think this is true in the context of choice and charters. I think it's exciting to see in certain places what's happening with savings accounts, but I don't think anyone's really figured that out, or that we've necessarily seen the level of impact. And the need is so unbelievably, the situation is so dire, right? Like, particularly here, in places, in states like Alabama, and we have just like this multi-generational poverty, just tremendously under-resourced communities. XQ and Carnegie. XQ was created with Emerson Collective. Ruslan Ali runs that work. Tim Knowles is at Carnegie, and the work that I get most excited about is happening in places like Indiana, where there are efforts underway to like rethink the architecture of K-12 education. So the Carnegie unit is 100 years old. There's loads of nonprofits that are sort of like self-perpetuating, that like keep pushing their old ideas upon us, even though they're outdated. And so Carnegie is trying to blow up the Carnegie unit. They're trying to move away from a time-based approach to K-12 education. XQ is playing a big role in collaborating with them to reimagine high schools. The high school movement, Byron Agis has a great article on this. It ran several years ago, but I go back and read it all the time. Like, agricultural jobs evaporated in our country at the turn of the century. Like, when we look at what's happening with AI and automation today, it's like not an entirely new phenomenon. We've had like radical shifts in the economy and in the labor market before. And what's interesting is that the high school movement grew out of the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy, historically. And again, high schools have a big role to play now. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening. It's hard for me to pick specific places.
But we need fresh thinkers that can reimagine where we're at and where we're going. Just a couple more questions. I'm going to hit you with the lightning round.
Sure.
So who are some of the education heroes today that you either work with or you see that are doing, the important stuff that can move society ahead?
There's a woman, I just joined her board, but there's a woman here in Birmingham who runs a really incredible early childhood nonprofit. So Birmingham is actually the largest implementation of the Lena technology, the sort of like talk pedometers, that track sort of the levels and extent of complex speech with little kids, which we know fires brain synapses and has a profound impact on early childhood development. She's doing extraordinary work, like grassroots, big impact, technology rich. I really admire what Tim and Ruslan are doing for sure. I'm biased, but Strata has a new initiative called Cred Lens, which is focused on understanding and quantifying the labor market outcomes associated with non-degree credentials.
Yeah.
That's really important.
Yeah.
I think Byron Agist is a hero. I mean, he's through the sheer force of will and really rigorous data is taking a concept that in some ways can and should be somewhat unpopular. Like, let's remove college degree requirements from job postings. And he's transformed it into a really, and galvanized a lot of support and to make it a really mainstream movement.
Yeah. That's about knowledge, not college. I mean, that's what's a critical idea to capture, for sure.
Yeah.
So last question. So you just got back from a fun family trip. You were in Turkey. What was that about?
My wife went to Turkey years ago for a White House advance trip. She loved it. And we try to take the kids somewhere different every summer. And we've been really fortunate to be able to do that. And so this year it was Turkey. And it was, I was busy. Sarah planned the trip. I wasn't paying much attention. I figured, sure, this will be really cool. And I'm just always excited to spend time with my family, my kids, and they're 13 and 14. So you kind of have to isolate them.
13, 14. That's amazing.
You have to take them to Turkey to force them to sit around the dinner table and play cards with you.
Yeah.
But But the thing that really hit me and was interesting is like I said, I was kind of a late bloomer academically, and didn't probably pay close attention in history class and the sort of to the emergence of the Ottoman Empire and in the Greeks and the Romans and the Ottomans and in the intersection with like today's sort of geopolitics. And so we're sitting in Istanbul, and I'm like looking at Google Maps, and there's like Ukraine, and you just start looking around at the kids all know the names of countries much better than I do. And you see like Lithuania, Estonia, and then there's like on the TV you turn it on and there's like talks at NATO and you just realize the sort of like proximity. And we had this incredible guide who talked to us a lot about this sort of the historic context. So for me, it was really in ways that it wouldn't be for people who are just like smarter, better educated than I am. It was really eye-opening and an interesting place to be at this moment in time.
So we're going to go through the lightning round. So
okay.
in one sentence to 3 sentences, give me your reaction, different people, different ideas. Ready?
This is dangerous.
Larry Berger.
Pioneer.
Chris Whittle.
Massive alumni network. I think this is like the point. I hosted a dinner. This is like back before I even had a house that was big enough to host a dinner. We hosted a dinner for Chris Whittle. I don't think like whether it's like from Richard Barth and like just the number of people, Jim Shelton, that in some form or fashion can trace their like education innovation lineage back to Chris and Edison. I think he's done a tremendous amount for our field that's totally underappreciated.
Great. John Katzman.
The showman, the greatest showman.
John McLaughlin.
He that's who introduced me to you in the first place.
Yep.
He's like one of the few remaining real godfathers of our sector. I think he coined the term education industry. He's also a Minnesotan. Nashvilleian, Alabamian via Minnesota. Yeah. So
Jeb Bush.
Fastest man on email. Also, I think someone who, if you think about like the impact that Chris Whittle has had on people and like the Whittle alumni core, like Jeb Bush has had that impact on public policy. And I know that like I have progressive friends who might be listening to this and it's like cue eye roll. Yeah. But there are just so many, he's so brilliant, and there are so many facets of public policy that grew out of the work that he did in Florida and the impact that he had nationally that have had such a profound impact on kids.
Mike Sandler.
He was like, fairy godfather, maybe to me. I miss him.
Yeah, we all do. Joe Lonsdale.
Mad scientist, mad genius. I think, again, like cue eye roll from, my progressive, some of my progressive friends, but I don't think there's anyone that puts the current moment in a broader, historic, context, and who cares more deeply about our country than Joe. So he's someone I admire a great deal.
What's your favorite podcast?
I don't really listen to very many podcasts. This is obviously my favorite. I love
great answer.
I do love listening to Smartless. So on long drives with my wife, that's probably the primary podcast that I've listened to. But there is a new AL.com has a new Alabama football podcast coming out, and I'm not going to miss that.
What's the most influential book you've read?
Education book, Winning the Brain Race by David Kerns and Dennis Doyle.
Perfect. Last question. Where's your favorite place to have a beer with your buddies?
I'm headed there tomorrow. There's a little bar on a dock at Alligator Point in Florida. I'm going tarpon fishing there tomorrow with a really brilliant guide and friend of mine. And I'm not as much of a beer drinker, but they make these incredible pina coladas. And then I come home and I think, gosh, like I should just start having pina coladas all the time. They just don't ever taste as good as they taste on the dock.
Yeah. Ben, as always, it's so much fun to visit with you. I love our friendship. I love our conversation. Thank you for joining us on Ed and the Edge.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.